Ernest Shackleton, born February 15, 1874, was a British polar explorer involved in 4 pioneering expeditions to the Antarctic in the 1900s. His first trip in the region was as a junior member of Captain Falcon Scott's Discovery expedition from 1901 to 1904, during which he, Scott, and Edward Wilson set a new southern record by sledging to 82 degrees south, just 8 degrees away from the geographic South Pole. However, Shackleton was forced to leave the expedition early in 1903 following a physical collapse, leaving him with a sense of failure and determined to return to the hostile polar conditions to prove he could tolerate them. 4 years later, in 1907, Shackleton organized the first of 3 of his own Antarctic expeditions and named it the Nimrod Expedition. The aim was to reach the South Pole, and although it failed to do so, Shackleton and 3 others achieved the new farthest south record, reaching 88 degrees on the 9th of January 1909, just 112 miles short of the goal. Nevertheless, the feat led him to becoming a hero in the eyes of the British public, and in turn, Ernest was knighted by King Edward VII in December 1909. Shackleton left his mark in Antarctica, and 2 years later, when the Norwegian polar explorer Ronald Amundsen became the first to reach the South Pole in December 1911, he had this to say: "Sir Ernest Shackleton's name will always be written in the annals of Antarctic exploration in letters of fire." 2 years after this, in December of 1913, Shackleton was again back in the news when he revealed details of his second expedition to Antarctica. Grandly titled the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, its aim was to make the first overland crossing of the Antarctic continent. Two ships would be used to transport a team of 56 men to the Weddell Sea, from where they would trek across the ice. The ships chosen for the expedition were the Scottish-built steam yacht Aurora and the 3-masted sailing vessel Endurance, which also had a coal-powered steam engine. Built in Norway and launched on December 17, 1912, Endurance was specifically designed for operating in pack ice. Shackleton bought her 2 years later for €14,000 and declared she would carry him and his crew of 26 men to Antarctica. Aurora would carry the remaining 27 men, serving as backup to Shackleton's team. The expedition caught the imagination of the British public and was largely privately funded by donations raised mostly by Shackleton himself. The British government put in €10,000, and the largest single private investor was a Scottish man named Sir James Caird, who put up €24,000. One of Endurance's 3 lifeboats was named in his honor. At 22 feet long, it would play a vital part in the drama that would later befall the expedition and its illustrious leader. On August 8th, the Endurance departed for Buenos Aires, ahead of Shackleton, who stayed behind to attend to last-minute details. When the leader finally reached Argentina in October, he found that the expedition was far from ready for its voyage south. Frank Worsley, who was appointed by Shackleton as captain of the Endurance, had allowed the discipline on board the ship to go AWOL during the journey south. Shackleton decided to restructure the ship's command in order to reduce the captain's discretionary authority. Another significant challenge involved Shackleton's credit, which was all but ruined by overextended loans taken for the expedition. The commander decided to proceed to South Georgia Island, the location of Britain's southernmost whaling village. He suspected that in the remote settlement there, captains might not know of his poor credit reputation, and he had the best chance of obtaining the remaining supplies he needed. At South Georgia, Shackleton confronted unexpected obstacles, noting that the ice floes were the farthest north they had seen in living memory. Local seamen warned that the ship might get trapped and advised him to postpone his mission until the following year. Shackleton decided to hole up in South Georgia for several weeks, watching for any change in the ice, and a month later, with conditions unchanged, the Endurance departed the whaling outpost for Antarctica. Only after a few days, on December 7, 1914, the men spotted the first ice pack. It was a surprising and ominous sight given that the Endurance was still a good distance from North Antarctica, and that it was then midsummer in the southern hemisphere. The crew members, unaware of the warnings the South Georgia whaling captains had given, seemed giddy with anticipation. On January 10, 1915, after weeks of dodging ice floes, the crew finally spotted Antarctic land. 5 days later, they saw a good bay with apparently smooth path to the interior, which Shackleton named the Dawson-Lambton Glacier. However, hoping to land in the Vosel Bay about 200 miles southwest, which would shorten the distance of the overland crossing, they continued around the continent. As the Endurance skirted the coast, icebergs forced it to draw back from the shore. The wind and moving ice froze the ship 80 miles offshore, just within sight of the desired landing point. After 9 days in the grip of the ice, Shackleton ordered the boiler fires put out and to begin to prepare for a long wait. also appointing individuals to hunt for seals and penguins whenever supplies on fresh meat ran low. Confined to tight quarters in the immobilized ship, the men's personality quirks and differences of habit caused irritation. A month and a half later, in mid-February 1915, a crack appeared in the ice ahead of the ship, creating a 200-yard vein of waterway in which the ship might move. The men jumped from the deck with picks and shovels in hopes of extending the opening towards shore. After a full day of heavy digging with virtually no progress, they gave up. The day quickly became weeks, and weeks became months, and still the ice held the ship. As April passed, daylight hours became fewer and fewer until by early May, the men found themselves in complete darkness of the Antarctic winter. The crew had hunted aggressively for seals, stockpiling 5,000 pounds of meat and blubber. As outside temperatures averaged negative 17 degrees Fahrenheit, the men converted the main hold of the ship into a communal living quarters, as the midsummer storms in June stirred the increasingly tempestuous currents beneath the ice. Distant storms began shoving the ice floes against, past, and under the boat, making the timbers groan and occasionally shifting the angle of the boat. For the next 5 months, the crew waited anxiously as the Endurance had drifted 685 miles northward towards softer but also more dangerous ice, capable of either opening a path or swallowing the ship whole. On October 17th, the ice rose and fell as if moved by one enormous wave and drove the Endurance to a 30-degree tilt where it froze solid once again. A week later, the ice began its final attack on the Endurance. 3 pressure ridges converged on the back end of the boat, suddenly ripping away the rudder. Gallons of water then spilled in. Shackleton directed the men to pump the water out while the carpenter worked furiously to build a dam. These efforts held the boat intact for 4 days, but finally it gave in. The decks warped under the immense pressure of the ice, and the timbers of the boat creaked loudly. Finally, the keel tore away and water rushed in. Shackleton then ordered the crew to abandon ship, and the men spent the night camped on the thick ice nearby. Shackleton quickly decided to march the men across the ice in hopes of reaching Paulet Island, 350 miles northwest, where a storehouse from the 1903 expedition still stood and contained significant rations. The march proved more difficult than Shackleton expected, estimating that the crew could manage to drag 2 of the 3 lifeboats filled with supplies. Each boat weighed nearly a ton, and the soft ice made the work of pulling the boats even more backbreaking. By the end of the first afternoon, they moved little over a mile. The following day, heavy snow kept the men from resuming their march until the afternoon. A few hours later, Shackleton halted travel as another heavy snowfall began. On the 3rd day, the men found themselves hip-high in soft snow as they moved. After only a quarter mile, Shackleton called off the grueling trek. They would wait for the ice around them to break up a bit and seize the first opportunity to launch the lifeboats towards Paulet Island. From there, Shackleton hoped that a small party of men could march to Wilhelmina Bay, where they would be able to make contact with a whaling ship. On November 1st, Shackleton ordered a permanent camp be established approximately 4 miles away from the Endurance. As always, Shackleton ordered the crew to keep busy. Days began with an early breakfast of seal steak or canned provisions, after which each man set out about his chores. While the cook prepared the next meal, others melted ice into drinking water, repaired equipment, or helped the carpenter strengthen the lifeboats. Over the next few weeks, the crew recovered valuable food, the 3rd lifeboat, and other supplies from the Endurance. Recovering more than 3 tons of rations from the wreck, 3 weeks later, Shackleton stood watching the ship in the distance. Crew in their tents heard him yell, "She's going down, boys!" Rushing outside, they all saw the Endurance's stern raise in the air and dive under the water. Within minutes, the dark spot of water which the Endurance sank into froze over, blending into the white ice that extended endlessly in all directions. In the weeks that followed, using navigational devices, the men closely monitored the movement of the ice floe they were camped on, hoping that winds and current would carry them north to Paulet Island. By mid-December, calculations revealed that they drifted in the overall direction away from land. Shackleton considered a second march westward toward land, believing that the edge of the ice, and thus an opportunity to launch the boats, lay between 150 and 180 miles to the west. Reaction to the news that the team would be moving again was mixed. Many felt that because of slightly warmer temperatures, the ice would be too soft to traverse. Because of this fear, Shackleton determined that the group would travel at night to capitalize on colder temperatures and thus more solid ice underfoot. The march west proved exhausting and discouraging. Men in harnesses pulled the boats and supply-laden sledges over slushy, uneven ice for hours at a time, but the effort gained them little ground. The team covered only 1.5 miles per day, making an extended trek all but impossible. On the 4th day, Shackleton set out a small party to scout ahead, and when he returned, the group declared their refusal to continue onward. openly challenging Shackleton's authority, contending that their duty to follow his orders had officially ended with the sinking of the Endurance. After a bitter confrontation, Shackleton declared that every man would be paid in full for each day until they reached safety. 2 days later, Shackleton halted the trek, realizing at the rate they were moving, it would have taken over 300 days to reach the land to the west. Having food for only 42 days, they had no other option but to camp on their current ice floe until conditions appeared more favorable. The team settled in to wait for the currents, hoping it would carry them to Paulet Island. The ice surrounding the camp was too wet and broken to allow for another attempt at marching the sledges, yet it remained too thick to allow launching all 3 boats. As the food supply dwindled, the men relied increasingly on seal, penguin, and occasionally sea lion for nourishment. By mid-January, harsh weather frequently confined the men to their tents, but rest was even difficult there, as the sleeping bags, often wet by day, froze solid cold by night. Months later, by April 1916, Shackleton spotted Clarence Island, a speck of land due east of the larger Elephant Island in the distance, indicating that the strong currents were carrying the ice floe towards land. Shackleton then decided that when the ice floe broke up and the boats could be launched, the crew would set sail for Deception Island, west of Clarence and Elephant Island. At Deception Island, they expected to find rations left for shipwrecked sailors. 2 days later, the crew launched lifeboats heading for land. The days that followed in the boats were painful. The men faced powerful squalls of ice and snow, frostbite, intense thirst, and waves that threatened to overturn the boats. Sleep was virtually impossible. Night temperatures fell to -7 degrees Fahrenheit, creating layers of ice inside and outside the boat. After several days, the weather cleared enough to attempt a reading of their longitude and latitude. The men estimated their progress thus far as anywhere from 30 to 60 miles towards their target. The reading, however, delivered what the captain privately called a terrible disappointment. The 3 boats had drifted 30 miles east and 11 miles south of their departure point. A change in plan was then deemed necessary. Shackleton revised the destination of the 3 boats. Winds made the closest land at Elephant Island unreachable, so they would aim instead to reach a bay of Antarctic mainland. For the remainder of the day, the 3 boats tossed about in choppy waters scattered by chunks of ice, and by late evening the winds had shifted dramatically, bringing in snow showers. The next morning, Shackleton surveyed his team. Quote, "Most of the men were now looking seriously worn and strained. Their lips were cracked, and their eyes showed red in their salted and crusted faces." Knowing they needed to reach land quickly, Shackleton announced the 4th change in destination. Hoping to make use of the southeast wind, he turned the boats towards Elephant Island. After 2 more days and nights of frigid winds and frostbite, the 3 boats struggled ashore at Elephant Island. The men were ecstatic to be on solid ground for the first time in more than 16 months. However, Elephant Island was far from hospitable. The small spot of land offered no shelter from the elements. The men's outlook, overall health, and dwindling food supply confronted Shackleton with a critical decision. Knowing they had to search for relief, the nearest port with assistance was 540 miles away, and due to the winds and swells, South Georgia Island, being 800 miles away, was their best bet at rescue. Once the decision to set forth for South Georgia was made, Shackleton had to decide who would come with him and who would stay and wait for further rescue. Appointing 2 crew members to temporary leaders while waiting, the crew strengthened the battered lifeboat the James Caird for the journey. On April 24, 1916, the 22-foot James Caird set out from Elephant Island carrying Shackleton, his 5 selected crewmen, a 6-week supply of food, and a few navigational devices. The weather on the first day of the trip was fair, allowing them to travel 45 miles. However, by the second afternoon, the boat was in the grip of a powerful storm and was tossed violently. By the 3rd day, the James Caird had progressed 128 miles from Elephant Island, but was off course from the position the crew had expected. For the next 24 hours, the ship was engulfed by a fierce gale that signified entry into the Drake Passage. This part of the ocean is known as one of the roughest parts of the ocean in the world. The need to remain on course was paramount. If the boat veered even a mile off schedule and missed South Georgia Island, it would be carried into 3,000 miles of open water with no chance whatsoever of finding land. By the 5th day, the group had traveled 238 of the 800 miles to South Georgia. Physical pain came to the men with every movement. Skin was rubbed raw by wet clothes. Saltwater boils developed. Legs swelled from constant immersion in salt water, and hands burned from frostbite. On the 8th day at sea, the crew noted with alarm that the James Caird was sitting low in the water, no longer rising and dropping with the tremendous motion of the waves. The source of the trouble was ice, which covered every exposed piece of wood, canvas, and rope. The crew immediately set to work chipping away the ice, a dangerous task that required the men to balance themselves on the slick surfaces of the deck in near total darkness. For 2 weeks at sea, the James Caird was within 80 miles of South Georgia Island. The ship's supply of drinking water had been contaminated by sea salt, and thirst began to plague the men. As they grew increasingly parched, swallowing became so painful that it precluded eating. Although their ultimate destination was the whaling station on the east coast of South Georgia, given the rough seas, constantly changing winds, and the crew's desperate thirst, it would be impossible to travel the additional 150 miles around the island. Thus, they aimed for landing on the uninhabited west coast. The next day, winds increased, and the sea swells began to grow in both size and force, eventually developing into a full-fledged hurricane that tossed the James Caird in all directions. Once the storm subsided, varying currents kept the ship from landing until May 10th, when, after 5 attempts, Shackleton and his crew sailed into a narrow cove on the west coast of South Georgia Island. From the boat, they saw plant life for the first time in over 17 months. Shackleton recalled the moment when the men finally stumbled ashore. We heard a gurgling sound peering around. We then found a stream of fresh water almost at our feet. A moment later, we were down on our knees drinking the pure, ice-cold water which put new life into us. After getting rehydrated, the plan was to rest for the night before sailing around the coast to the whaling station. But late into the night, the storm that arose drove the small sailing boat into the rocks along the shoreline, damaging it beyond repair. The only other option was to trek by foot the 29 miles across the island, which had never been done before. Having a map of only the coastline, early the next morning, on May 19, 1916, Shackleton and his crew set out on the arduous, unknown inland trek. Within an hour, they were trudging uphill through soft, ankle-deep snow. Making several wrong turns going up mountain peaks that provided no way through to the other side, they were forced to backtrack down 3 separate mountain passes. At sunrise, the men came over a slope and saw in the distance the outlines of Stromness Bay. Site of the whaling station 12 miles away, they finally reached it 8 hours later. Having traveled 36 hours without sleep or shelter, the appearance of the 3 foul-smelling men, dressed in rags, with overgrown beards and faces covered in grime, came as a great shock to the whalers. Knowing that the Endurance had sailed out from South Georgia 2 years earlier, they had all thought the crew and the boat alike were lost and were to never be seen again. Shackleton wasted no time in making preparations to rescue the 22 men left on Elephant Island. Over the course of 4 months, Shackleton attempted 3 separate times on 3 different boats to rescue his crew, coming within 100 miles on the 3rd attempt. Each time they were unable to get to the island due to the ice floats damaging the boats. However, on the 4th attempt in August 1916, more than 2 years after their initial departure on the Endurance, Shackleton on a boat named Yelcho was able to reach the shore of Elephant Island. All of his men had survived the wait and eagerly boarded the ship. On the ride back to civilization, the entirety of the crew celebrated, and when they finally reached South Georgia, the crew's survival made headlines back in England. Despite an initial wave of interest and press coverage, the vast new terrors of the First Modern War made Shackleton's feat in the South seem largely insignificant. Unbeknownst to all the men stranded in the Antarctic Circle, the glory that surrounded their departure had turned to indifference. Over the course of the next 4 years, Shackleton lectured and wrote a book about the events that took place, with all profits going to pay off the debts he incurred to even attempt the journey. And in 1920, he got the urge to conquer the ice again. Gathering a crew and another ship, they headed back to South Georgia on their way to the South Pole. Sadly, he suffered back-to-back heart attacks before they set off for the icy wasteland, and he died on January 5, 1922, at the age of 47. At the request of his wife Emily, his crew members buried him on South Georgia Island. 107 years after Endurance sank, the FMHT organization was able to find the Endurance shipwreck due to the final position recorded by Captain Frank Worsley in his diary. He noted the approximate coordinates, and on March 5, 2022, the Endurance was found at a depth of 9,869 feet, when it became clear just how good the diary note was. The wreckage was located approximately 6.2 miles from the coordinates in Frank Worsley's log. That is the story of Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance expedition. If you want to see more fascinating stories, check out these or others on my channel.